Well, I certainly think that if you're worried about American backlash, you can probably find middle ground. I don't think the United Kingdom is going to be, ostracized from a trade deal with the US because they're trying to find a way to keep working with Huawei. But I want to say something much more simple, which is that your economy in Canada is overwhelmingly integrated with that of the United States. Right. So the idea that you would embrace a tech standard that will be in every chip in the Internet of Things. It'll be in smart cities. It'll be in your clothing. It'll create data ecosystems around you. And the Americans are going to have a different system is on its face suicidal. Right. Like you just wouldn't do that. Right. It has nothing to do with the Americans telling you not to. It's just self-preservation. I mean, at the end of the day, the future of Canada's economy is not China, right? It's not Japan, it's not Germany, it's the United States. So, I mean, really, it's fine to have a Pyrrhic discussion around it, but I mean, the reality is you don't want to go a different way from the Americans. That would just be a bad thing to do.
So the trouble with that, of course, is it's also logical. We got 2 Canadian citizens moldering away in Chinese prisons. We've seen the ire from China of even the question, the whole Huawei CFO extradition. We feel the Chinese irritation with us already.
Yeah, they're pretty annoyed, it's true.
Still worth it? Still worth it?
I mean, look, you've done things that have annoyed the Chinese before that had nothing to do with the United States. Dalai Lama, for example, human rights concerns. I mean, the Canadians can be Canadians, and that sometimes means annoying the Chinese. You are very different in orientation, right? Now, I mean, it's horrible to see a former diplomat being tortured in China right now. And I mean, I know that, there was back channel conversations with the Americans saying, well, don't sign the phase 1 deal until these 2 Canadians get freed. Now, I'd hate to be the Canadian diplomat delivering that message to the Trump administration because it's not going to go very far. But this is a horrible thing. And I mean, I think as the Canadians, what do? Well, you're not going to interfere. I mean, you're going to go through the legal process. You have, unlike China, an independent judiciary. And that is what it is. And I can't see the Canadians doing any differently with the Saudis or with the Chinese. And we've seen that play out over the last year.
We did get some progress in the phase 1 trade deal, and there is hope that at some point, probably post-election, I guess is the betting, that we see further resolution. Is this enough? I mean, are we getting to a place where we can call a victory on either side for this, of any of the goals, the original goals that America had?
I mean, certainly insofar as Trump has been laser-like focused on the deficit vis-a-vis China, which is not what economists think he should be focused on, and wants them to buy more stuff, that is the intention. We'll see how coronavirus affects that, especially as the Canadian economy doesn't grow as fast this year. But that doesn't resolve structural issues. And if you saw Mike Pompeo earlier today talking about the Chinese Communist Party as by far the largest threat to the United States. This does not sound like we are inching towards harmony and breakthrough, and the likelihood of a phase 2 deal either before elections or after elections in a meaningful way. In other words, that would actually end Chinese subsidies to key strategic industries, unwind Chinese state capitalism. In other words, not be Chinese. They're about the same as Hamas saying that we renounce state violence against Israel. I mean, it's just, they would no longer be the Chinese system as we know it. I mean, the problem is that the Americans for a long time really actually believed that as China got wealthy, it would align with the Americans in terms of free market and rule of law and liberal democracy. And I mean, that's not happening, right? And that's hard for us to digest. But that is the reality, and that would create more competition and more conflict even in ideal geopolitical environment, and we're presently very far from an ideal geopolitical environment.
So then let's come around to, because it is a very different kind of state, this concern about security. We as private citizens are relinquishing our privacy all the time for one reason or another.
Right.
Which makes me wonder whether even at a state level, there's a kind of a shrug around, well, maybe they'll spy on us, but what does it matter particularly? We'll try to keep them out of our IP. Does it matter? I mean, if this is I don't want to say a rogue state, but this is a non-democratic state, as it is, with great power in a region, do we need to keep them from spying on us?
I mean, you don't want them spying on you. They certainly are going to try to protect IP more effectively going forward because they're developing world standards in some types of IP. I mean, their facial recognition, their voice recognition today is better than that of the United States, and no one else is close. So, I mean, if you're China, you need to actually create better IP protections simply to ensure that that is strong. It's not like they're the only ones that engage in trying to steal this stuff. But I think we also need to understand that part of the problem is that technology is increasingly empowering a very small group of people with the data and the cash to use it. And that means the Chinese government, it means Facebook, it means, you know, Apple, it means Amazon. And that's a dangerous place for the average citizen. That's a more dangerous place for the average Canadian, the average European. I mean, the Europeans are much more concerned about privacy than the Americans and the Chinese. Only problem, they don't have tech companies. So, I mean, they can set regulatory standards, and they should, and those standards will be robust, and increasingly some pieces of them will be picked up. We've seen GDPR in California, for example, but that's very different from saying that's where the world is heading. The world will head to where the companies drive them, both state-controlled and directed, like in China, as well as free market-driven and capturing the regulatory process, like in the United States. And where is the citizen in all of this? The citizen gets increasingly angry living in a system that feels delegitimized, and that is a part of why we got Trump, of why Bernie Sanders is leading in Iowa right now, of why we got Brexit, of why even politics here in polite, friendly Canada have become so much more fractious than they've been at any time since I've been on this planet.
I do want to ask you about the Israeli-Palestinian deal
Yeah.
that Trump has put on the table.
Yep.
Your view of it?
It is by far the most pro-Israel deal that's ever been put forward. Having said that, it's also a deal that's gotten significant support from the Arab world. And what that tells you is that the Palestinians don't matter as much. And that is not a happy thing, it's just a real thing. It's that today, conflict with Iran is bringing Israel and the Arab states together. Concerns about Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the war in Yemen and Libya and Iraq and Syria, these are all higher priorities than let's get an Israel-Palestinian peace deal. And in Israel, it wasn't just Netanyahu that went to Washington. Benny Gantz, who's running against Netanyahu, went to Washington, and he said, I will do everything in my power if I'm elected as prime minister to actually bring this deal to fruition. So actually, on this core national security issue, the two people running against each other agree completely.
Right.
And so where does that leave the Palestinians? Well, if they wanted to take the deal, it leaves them with 70% of the West Bank, a state having to renounce violence and recognize Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people and its rightful state, and hopefully getting a bunch of cash as well. But I mean, the sad thing is this is the worst deal they've ever been offered. It's also the best deal they'll ever get going forward. And if you say that's really sad for the Palestinians, I agree. But it also, I think one of the reasons why this has gotten as much traction in the region as it has, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, I mean, you know, the Emiratis sent their ambassador to this signing ceremony with Netanyahu. There wasn't a Palestinian official within 1,000 miles. I mean, that's quite something, right? So why is it happening? It's happening because the Trump administration recognized that the geopolitics of the Middle East have changed. You know, the Americans have pretended, they've represented that they're an honest broker between Israel and Palestine for decades now. It's not true. Nobody believed it, right? Maybe Carter was, but since then, no. Trump hasn't pretended. Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Trump recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. It is very clear that he's not an honest broker, but he is representing that he's an honest broker between Israel and the Gulf Arabs. And that's interesting, because his first trip as president, it wasn't to Canada, it was to Saudi, he touched the orb, remember the orb, and then to Israel. Probably his best trip as president. And this is the logical outcome 3 years later of that.
Does this deal, with the support of some of the large part of the Arab world, make the world safer? If this goes through, are we safer than we were if it does not?
It is certainly safer if the Israelis and the Arab states normalize relations. Now, by the way, that has nothing to do with whether the Palestinians are part of the deal. Okay? If the Palestinians were to accept the deal, of course, it would make us safer, make everyone safer. But they've already rejected it out of hand, and this existing government is very far. The Palestinian government is very far, fragmented as it is between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. Now, it is true that over time, they're not going to get the money either domestically or from the region, that they were getting, right? They're not going to get the political support, so there'll be much more pressure on them to change. But the pressure is going to be surrender, right? And a lot of people don't want to surrender, even if that's the pressure. And so the question is, I mean, although I was with Jared yesterday and he made very clear, like, this is not a regime change policy, but there is going to be a lot more pressure on this government to either put up or get out. And I think that's interesting. That's kind of aligned with what the Trump policy is on Iran, which so far, much to the consternation of the Canadians, the Europeans, and others, their unilateral withdrawal from the deal. But you can say vis-a-vis Iran, the policy has had some success, and that's interesting, right? That's interesting.
I need to ask about coronavirus and where you think it fits into the risks in the world. I mean, there's obviously been a very strong concerted response that seems like it's working to the extent that these things can work. Or should we be more worried about it than we are? Are we the right amount of worried?
Well, more cases than SARS,
right. But milder.
Milder, but in China, a place where we don't trust the data, where they don't have enough hospitals, where the government doesn't have the same level of legitimacy, that's a problem. I mean, I think we need to understand that. Let's hope that we get through this. Let's hope that the response proves to be enough. Let's hope that the virulence and the mortality around this disease is stoppable in relatively short order. But let's also recognize that a world where China is the largest economy, and we'll be living in that world in a very short time, is a world that necessarily is much more dangerous and unstable, not because China's evil, but because they're poor, but because they just don't have the same standards and transparency and data and resilience of their political institutions that you do in Canada, that I do in the United States. And that's a problem. That's a problem, and it's not just about coronavirus, it's about cyber, it's about natural disasters, it's about everything. And that's true even if the US and China have fantastic relations. This is where we're headed.
So therefore, is the response outside of China logical to say we're going to stop flights, we're going to quarantine the country in a way?
You have to be more careful when you're dealing with a country where it's harder to understand and respect the data than if we were dealing with Canada. I don't think we'd have that same response. I think that's right.